My dad doesn't buy me food, so I started collecting bottles to buy a meal. When my teacher saw me at a dumpster, I said, "This is how I eat." She reported it. That night, my dad yelled, "Now the school thinks I best eat you." I whispered, "Because you do." I was 12 the first time I realized hunger wasn't normal. Not my kind of hunger, at least. It was during a math test, and my stomach growled so loud the kid next to me, Jonas, smirked and slid a granola bar across the desk. "Take it," he whispered. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I shook my head. "Nah, I'm good." His smirk faded a little. He unwrapped it anyway, but he ate slower, like he knew I was watching. Most kids don't have to think about food. They assume it'll be there when they get home. Dinner on the table, snacks in the pantry, leftovers in the fridge. But at my house, dinner was a gamble. Some nights there was food. Other nights, my dad would get home drunk, pass out on the couch, and forget to feed me. Or he'd eat whatever we had left and tell me to quit whining. I used to ask why we didn't have enough. Before she left, my mom would just sigh and say, "Money's tight this month, baby." But this month turned into every month. Then one day, she was gone. I don't know exactly why. I remember the fights. I remember the sound of plates smashing, the way she'd lock herself in the bathroom and cry. I remember the morning I woke up, wandered into the kitchen, and found my dad sitting at the table alone, drinking coffee like nothing was different. "When's mom coming back?" I'd asked. He didn't look up, just took a sip. "She ain't." I stood there, waiting for him to tell me he was joking, that she was coming back for me, that she hadn't left me behind. But he never did. I learned quick. Learned that if I wanted to eat, I had to figure out myself. I used to take extra milk cartons from the cafeteria. The lunch ladies would give me weird looks, but they never stopped me. Then, when I realized that wouldn't be enough, I started collecting bottles and cans. A 5-cent deposit per can wasn't much, but if I collected enough, I could buy something small, a bag of chips, maybe a sandwich from the gas station down the street. That's what I was doing that day after school, digging through the dumpster behind Patterson's grocery, when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I froze. Slowly I turned. It was Mrs. Holloway, my English teacher. She stood there holding a grocery bag in one hand, her keys in the other. Her eyes flicked to my hands, then to the open dumpster. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice careful. I swallowed. "Just looking." "For what?" I hesitated. If I lied, she'd know. If I told the truth, she'd make a big deal out of it. So I just said, "This is how I eat." I saw something change in her expression, a flicker of something. Anger? Sadness? Pity? She didn't say anything. Just stood there for a moment, staring at me like she was trying to piece something together. Then she nodded, like she'd already made up her mind. "Come with me." I should have known she wouldn't just let it go. That night, my dad was waiting for me when I got home. The second I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. He was sitting in his chair, beer in hand, the TV on but ignored. He didn't look at me right away. "School called," he said, voice steady. I set my backpack down, slowly, my chest tightening. "Said a teacher saw you digging through trash." I didn't move. "They think I don't feed you." His voice was calmer than it should have been, like he was testing me. I stared at the floor, my stomach twisting. "You got something to say?" he asked. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was exhaustion or hunger or the years of silence catching up to me all at once. I whispered, "Because you don't." The air went still. Then he stood. It happened fast, his hand shooting out, the sharp crack as his palm met my face. My head snapped sideways, pain exploding through my cheek. I stumbled, caught myself against the wall. The room spun. I tasted blood. "You want to be a little snitch?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You want to make me look bad?" I squeezed my eyes shut. He grabbed my arm, yanking me up. His breath reeked of alcohol. "I give you a roof," he spat. "I give you a place to sleep. And this is how you thank me?" I kept my mouth shut. I learned a long time ago that arguing back only made it worse. He let go of me with a shove. I hit the wall, bracing myself against it. "Next time you want to dig through garbage like a damn stray, don't come back," he muttered, turning away. I stood there, my face burning, my hands shaking. Something in me cracked that night. I wasn't going to survive in this house. That much was clear. I had two choices: stay and let him break me, or leave and save myself. I picked the second one. I waited until he passed out. Then I grabbed my backpack, stuffed in what little I had, my school books, a hoodie, the $32 I'd managed to save from recycling cans. I didn't have a plan. Just knew I had to go. I hesitated at the door, looking back at him. He was sprawled on the couch, snoring, an empty beer bottle on the floor beside him. For a second, I thought about waking him up, telling him I was leaving. But then I remembered the slap. I turned and walked out the door. And I didn't look back. I didn't have a plan. I just walked. The streetlights flickered overhead as I made my way through town, the weight of my backpack digging into my shoulders. The night air was cold, and I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, shoving my hands into the front pocket. I had nowhere to go, no family nearby, no friends who'd understand. The only thing I knew was that I couldn't go back. My feet carried me without thinking, past the gas station, past the shuttered shops downtown. I ended up at the only place I could think of, behind Patterson's grocery, where the dumpsters sat in their usual row, their lids propped open. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. I sat down behind the largest one, resting my head against the cold metal. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. Hunger was familiar. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard a voice. "You're still here." I flinched. Mrs. Holloway stood a few feet away, wearing a thick sweater over her dress. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. I scrambled up, heart hammering. I was just, she sighed. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" I swallowed hard. She didn't wait for an answer. "Come on," she said, turning back toward her car. I hesitated. "You're not in trouble," she added. "Just come with me." I wasn't sure why I trusted her. Maybe because she was the first person who had ever noticed. The first person who didn't just look away. I followed her. Her house was small but warm, filled with the scent of something cooking. She motioned for me to sit at the kitchen table while she stirred a pot on the stove. "I made soup," she said. "Hope you like chicken noodle." I nodded, even though I didn't care what it was. She set a bowl in front of me, along with a plate of bread. I hesitated only a second before grabbing a piece and tearing into it. She sat across from me, watching me eat. "You want to tell me what happened?" I didn't answer right away. I kept my eyes on the bowl, my spoon scraping the bottom. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet. "My dad got mad." She sighed. "I figured." I set the spoon down. "Are you going to call someone?" "I already did," she admitted. "CPS is going to investigate." My stomach twisted. "That's a good thing," she added. "They can help." I almost laughed. Help. People like my dad knew how to hide things. He'd smile, shake their hands, tell them what they wanted to hear. He'd clean up the house, make it look like nothing was wrong. And when they left, he'd make me pay for it. "Can I stay here?" I blurted. She looked surprised. She hesitated. "I wish you could. But it's not that simple." Of course it wasn't. Nothing ever was. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine. "I promise. I won't let them send you back to him." I wanted to believe her. I really did. 2 days later, CPS showed up at my dad's house. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it from a neighbor. The social worker knocked, clipboard in hand, and my dad answered the door with a big, friendly smile. Invited them in. Told them he had no idea why anyone would report him. "I love my son," he probably said. "I take good care of him." I knew exactly how it went. I knew they looked around, saw nothing out of place, maybe asked him a few questions. And when it was all over, they left. That night, my phone buzzed. One new message. "Dad, they didn't find SHD. You think you can run from me?" A second message. "Dad, they're going to regret this." I stared at the screen, hands shaking. I wasn't free. Not yet. But I would be. One way or another. I didn't respond to his messages. I turned my phone off and shoved it into the bottom of my backpack. My hands were still shaking, but I forced myself to take a breath. Deep in, slow out. I was safe. For now. Mrs. Holloway let me stay the night on her couch, but by the next morning, she was making phone calls. She told me she was trying to find a safe place for me. Maybe a temporary foster home. I barely heard her. My mind was stuck on my dad's texts. "You're going to regret this." I knew him too well to think he was bluffing. He'd gone away with it. Again. CPS probably walked into that house, saw nothing wrong, and left with a polite smile. Maybe they asked if he wanted to take parenting classes. Maybe they gave him a brochure about healthy communication. Then they walked away, convinced they had done their job. And now he was angry. I had humiliated him. I had made him look bad. That was enough to set him off. I didn't go to school that day. Mrs. Holloway called in for me while I sat on her couch, staring at the same spot on the wall for hours. At some point, she sat down next to me. "Hey," she said softly. "We're going to figure this out." I swallowed. "He's going to come looking for me." Her jaw tightened. "He knows where I go." I whispered. "Where I hang out. If I go to school, he'll wait for me outside." I didn't even realize I was shaking until she put a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to go back there," she said. I almost laughed. They already believed him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood. "Come with me," she said. I followed her to her office, where she opened a drawer and pulled out a small notepad. She flipped through it, then scribbled something down on a piece of paper. "I have a friend," she said. "Her name is Marisol. She works with kids who don't have anywhere to go." I looked at the paper. "A phone number. If you want," she continued, "I can take you to her today. She might be able to get you placed somewhere safe." Safe. That word didn't mean much to me anymore. But I nodded anyway. Marisol's office was in a small brick building downtown. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 30s, with dark curly hair pulled back into a bun and glasses that kept slipping down her nose. She smiled when she saw me. "You must be." She stopped, glanced at Mrs. Holloway. "We'll keep this confidential." I knew what she meant. No real names. No records that could be traced. I sat down across from her. She didn't ask me 100 questions like the CPS lady probably did when she visited my dad. She just handed me a bottle of water and said, "I'm here to help. No judgment. No pressure. Just talk to me." I didn't know where to start. So I started at the beginning. By the time I was done talking, it was dark outside. Marisol leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "Okay," she said. "Here's the deal. Legally, you're still in your father's custody, but there are ways around that." I swallowed. "Like what?" She tapped her fingers against her desk. "We can file an emergency petition for a guardian. Someone who can take you in without sending you back to him." I frowned. "But who?" She looked at Mrs. Holloway. I turned to her surprised. She hesitated, then nodded. "If that's what you want." I couldn't speak. No one had ever volunteered to take care of me before. No one had ever wanted to. My throat tightened. I nodded. "Okay," Marisol said. Then we moved fast. That night, I stayed with Mrs. Holloway again. I still couldn't shake the feeling that my dad was out there, waiting. Maybe he was parked outside. Maybe he was pacing in our house, drinking himself into a worse rage. Maybe he was already planning what he'd do when he got me back. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about how unfair it was. How he got to sit in that house, lie to the world, pretend he was a good father, while I had to hide like I was the problem. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. And for the first time, I wasn't just scared of him. I wanted him to pay. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of voices. I wasn't used to waking up in a place that felt safe. No yelling. No slamming doors. Just the low murmur of Mrs. Holloway talking to someone in the kitchen. I sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. My body ached from sleeping on the couch, but I didn't care. It was better than the floor of my dad's house. I stood and stretched, listening. "Just need to move quickly," Mrs. Holloway was saying. Marisol's voice answered, low and serious. "We will. I already put in the paperwork, but you know how these things go. If he fights it, it could take weeks." A knot tightened in my stomach. If he fights it, of course he would. I moved toward the kitchen, my footsteps light. Mrs. Holloway and Marisol were sitting at the small table, 2 cups of coffee between them. When they saw me, they stopped talking. "Morning," Mrs. Holloway said. Her voice was gentle, but there was something in her eyes, something guarded. "Morning," I muttered. Marisol cleared her throat. "We have to talk about what happens next." I pulled out a chair and sat. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Legally, your dad still has parental rights. That means we need more than just your word to keep you away from him." I stiffened. "What do you mean? We need proof." My stomach twisted. Proof. As if the bruises weren't enough. As if the years of neglect weren't enough. Marisol must have seen the look on my face because she softened her tone. "I believe you. Mrs. Holloway believes you. But the system? It's slow. And your father, he's manipulative. He knows what to say. He knows how to make himself look like the victim." I gritted my teeth. He'd been doing it for years. Playing the role of the hardworking single dad. The man who was doing his best while his ungrateful son made trouble. I clenched my fists under the table. "What do I have to do?" Marisol hesitated. "We need to get something on him. Something that proves, without a doubt, that he's dangerous." Dangerous? I already knew he was. But that wasn't enough. I had to show the rest of the world. That afternoon, I made a decision. I was going back. Mrs. Holloway was against it the second I brought it up. "Absolutely not," she said. "It's too risky." Marisol was hesitant too. "What if he hurts you again?" But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't going to walk back in there unprotected. I pulled out my phone. "I'll record everything," I said. "Every word, every threat. If he thinks I'm coming back, he'll let his guard down." They both looked uneasy. But eventually, Marisol sighed. "If you're sure." "I am." Because this wasn't just about running away anymore. This was about ending it. I knew my dad's routine. By 7, he was home from work. By 8, he was 2 beers in. By 9, he was drunk enough to say things he shouldn't. I timed it perfectly. When I walked up the front steps of the house, my hands were shaking, but I forced myself to steady them. I knocked. A pause. Then heavy footsteps, the familiar creak of the floorboards. The door swung open. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His face twisted into a smirk. "Look who finally grew some balls." I swallowed hard. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside, still smirking. "So you finally realized you belong here, huh?" I didn't answer. I walked past him, into the living room. It was exactly the same. Dirty beer cans on the coffee table, cigarette butts in the ashtray. The air smelled like stale smoke and sweat. He shut the door behind me. "School call you back yet?" he asked, cracking open another beer. I shook my head. "Not yet." He scoffed. "Figures. All that bullshit you pulled. And for what? You think someone's going to save you?" He laughed. "No one gives a damn about a kid like you." I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "Keep him talking." He took a long sip, then pointed at me. "You embarrassed me. Made me look bad. And for what? A little attention?" I said nothing. His face darkened. You don't get to make me look bad. I braced myself. Here it comes. I should teach you a lesson, he muttered, setting his beard down. He took a step closer. My pulse pounded in my ears. Do it. Say the words. Make him show who he really is. I lifted my chin, looking him dead in the eye. You always say that, I whispered. But you're just a coward who picks on someone smaller than you. His nostrils flared. You little, he lunged. I turned, bolting for the door. Get back here. I grabbed the doorknob just as he caught my hoodie, yanking me back. I twisted, kicking out, barely managing to slip free. I stumbled forward, shoving the door open, sprinting outside. He followed, but I wasn't alone, because right there, parked across the street, was Marisol's car, and standing next to it, 2 cops. For a second, my dad froze. Then I pulled out my phone and hit play. His voice filled the night air. You embarrassed me. Made me look bad. I should teach you a lesson. His face drained of color. The cops moved. Mr. Harlow, one of them said, we need you to come with us. I took a step back, heart hammering. My dad turned to me, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was the kind that made my stomach drop. You think this is over? He murmured. Then the cops grabbed him, and I watched as they took him away. I stood there, watching the cops shove my dad into the back of their squad car. The flashing red and blue lights painted his face in sharp, flickering colors. His jaw was clenched, but his eyes never left mine. You think this is over? The word stuck to me like a shadow. The cop in charge, Officer Brennan, turned to me. He was a heavy-set guy, probably in his late 40s, with tired eyes and a mustache that twitched when he talked. You all right, kid? I swallowed and nodded. He studied me for a moment before gesturing to Marisol, who was still standing by her car. We'll take it from here. You go on with her. I glanced at my dad one last time. His smirk was gone. For the first time, he looked small. I turned and walked away. The next few days were a blur. There were meetings, interviews, statements to give. CPS got involved again, but this time they actually listened. The recording I made was enough to push things forward, enough to get my dad formally charged with child endangerment and assault. Marisol pulled every string she had, and within a week, I was placed in Mrs. Holloway's care as my official guardian. I had a home, a real one, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that my dad wasn't done with me. I was right. A month after his arrest, my dad tried to fight for custody. He sat in court, dressed in a cheap suit, looking clean-cut and respectable. He told the judge that he'd made mistakes, that he was willing to change, that I was just a troubled kid acting out. I sat across from him, listening to every word. And then, when it was my turn, I looked him straight in the eye and told the truth. Not just about that night. About all of it. The hunger, the beatings, the nights I spent sleeping in the cold because he locked me out, the way he made me feel like I was nothing. I told him about the bottle collecting, about the dumpster behind Patterson's, about how the only reason anyone even knew what was happening to me was because a teacher saw me digging through trash. I didn't cry. I didn't need to, because when I finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked shaken. And when the final decision came, it was simple. Custody? Denied. Parental rights? Terminated. My dad was done. I wish I could say he disappeared after that. But life isn't a movie. He still tried to get to me, sending letters, even calling from burner phones. He made promises, then threats, then more promises. I ignored him, and eventually he stopped. I don't know where he is now. Maybe in some rundown apartment, drinking himself into oblivion. Maybe in another town, trying to charm his way into someone else's life. I don't care, because I have mine back. Mrs. Holloway became more than just my guardian. She became my family. For the first time, I had real meals. A warm bed. Someone who actually gave a damn whether I came home or not. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was enough. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was living.